All right, why don't we go ahead and get started? It's a lot of fun to see a lot of new faces, but also a lot of old friends, so I'm really looking forward to the discussions we're going to have today. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Aaron Weldon. I'm Assistant Director for Religious Liberty at the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, and something like this is a thing that I've been wanting to do for a while, so I'm really excited about what we're going to be doing today. I want to especially thank the Knights of Columbus and the John Paul II Shrine for being gracious hosts to us. This is a kind of a unique facility to host an event like this, so I'm very happy that we were able to work this out, that they were able to host us today. I also want to make sure to say a special thank you to our sponsors. I don't know if we would be eating if it weren't for our sponsors. So a special thank you to the Institute for Human Ecology at the Catholic University of America and the Center for Law and the Human Person at the Columbus School of Law at the Catholic University of America. Again, really glad that we were able to collaborate on this, and as you're eating your lunch or enjoying snacks at the happy hour, you'll want to thank the people from those institutions. Just one logistical note, our panels and lunch are all going to be up here, so we're going to be here through the afternoon. Then part of the reason that we set this up to have a short break is that, as I mentioned earlier, it's kind of a unique place to have an event like this. There are chapels, there's a John Paul II exhibit downstairs. So we just wanted to make sure that, especially for those of you who've never been here, that people had a chance to visit the chapels, the exhibits, and that sort of thing. So be sure to do that if you can. And then at 3:30, our happy hour will be down on the lower level in the atrium. Right? So now let me introduce Bishop Rhoades. Bishop Kevin Rhoades was installed as the 9th Bishop of Fort Wayne, South Bend by Pope Benedict XVI on January 13th, 2010. He currently serves as Chair of the USCCB Committee on Religious Liberty, a member of the USCCB Committee on Doctrine, and a member of the USCCB Ad Hoc Committee Against Racism. He also serves as a member of the Foundation Board of Catholic Relief Services, as chair of the Board of Directors of Our Sunday Visitor, Episcopal Moderator of the Society of Catholic Scientists, and a member of the Board of Directors of the National Eucharistic Congress and member of the Bishops' Advisory Board of the National Eucharistic Revival. So, very busy. But I also want to especially just note that he has really been a lot of fun to work with. Like, I've enjoyed our conversations about the things we're talking about today. We've had some great conversations over the phone. I really admire his leadership, and I am glad that he is here to welcome us today. So, Bishop Rhoades.
Thank you, Aaron. Good morning, everybody. Very happy to see all of you, and thank you for joining us for this symposium on religious freedom in a culture of self-invention. I think this is a really special event because it's an opportunity to engage in a conversation that I hope will inform the work of the bishops, our efforts to promote religious liberty. The committee, the USCCB Committee for Religious Liberty, seeks to strengthen and sustain religious freedom by assisting the U.S. bishops as individuals, but also collectively, to teach about religious freedom to our people, to the faithful, and to the broader public, and to promote and defend religious freedom in law and policy. To that end, much of our work involves advocacy in the legal and political spheres, but my brother bishops and I have long recognized that cultural challenges may be the most important challenges of all. Because even if we're successful in the courts, or in Congress, or in regulations that protect believers from coercion, even if we secure religious liberty protections in law, those protections mean very little if our people have been formed by the broader culture to live as if the goal of life is created by us rather than to open ourselves to the truth about God and his creation. So immunity from coercion is not nothing. Dignitatis Humanae, the document on religious liberty of the Second Vatican Council, teaches that religious freedom means that all people are immune from coercion, such that no one is forced to act in a manner contrary to his beliefs. But this freedom has an end, a purpose, a telos. It's a freedom for the truth. And this is what the Second Vatican Council says. Man has been made by God to participate in the divine law, with the result that under the gentle disposition of divine providence, he can come to perceive ever more fully the truth that is unchanging. Wherefore, every man has the duty, and therefore the right, to seek the truth in matters religious. So this is a freedom that is oriented in the first place toward truth and beauty, and ultimately to the source of creation. A culture of self-invention, a culture that views the self as the center of meaning, and that regards personal identity as a matter entirely of our own creation, stifles the very impulse that religious freedom is meant to support. It may even be the case that a political community formed by such a culture will have little use for religious freedom. How did we get to this point in our culture? In his seminal essay, From Pilgrims to Tourists, or A Short History of Identity, the sociologist Zygmunt Bauman notes that one thinks of identity whenever one is not sure where one belongs. So the problem of how to construct one's personal identity, of how to determine one's values, so to speak, arises in response to a kind of rootlessness or disembeddedness. How should we Christians respond? What does the promotion of religious freedom look like in a culture that sees the good life as one spent constructing and maintaining an identity rather than pursuing truth? So I'm very grateful for the excellent group of speakers who are here to help us think through these issues. I'm grateful to our moderators who will lead us through these discussions. And I'm grateful to everyone who's taking time out of their busy schedules to join us. And I encourage you to take this opportunity to contribute to the discussion. Those of us who are members, consultants, and staff are looking forward to listening to and learning from this impressive group that we have gathered here. And then it is our intention in November to bring the fruits of what we hear today in our discussions to the whole body of U.S. bishops. So what's happening today is very important, and I just want to say again, thank you to all of you.
So if our first panel can go ahead and come up, and I will introduce them. And this panel is going to reflect on the question, what do we mean by a culture of self-invention? What does it look like? And I think we're going to touch a little bit on what are some of the implications for religious liberty. I am happy that we have Mary Rice Hasson to moderate this panel. Mary is the Kate O'Byrne Senior Fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center in Washington. She co-founded and directs the Person and Identity Project, an initiative that educates and equips parents and faith-based institutions to promote the truth about the human person and counter gender ideology. She is an attorney and policy expert and has been a 3-time keynote speaker for the Holy See at the United Nations Commission on the Status of Women on topics related to women, education, and gender ideology. She's also one of our all-star consultants. She comes to all the meetings and always has contributions to make. So very happy that she was able to join us for this. She's going to be joined by D.C. Schindler, Abigail Favale, and Marc DeGirolami. Dr. Schindler is professor of metaphysics and anthropology at the Pontifical John Paul II Institute for Studies on Marriage and Family at the Catholic University of America. He's an editor of the English language edition of Communio, a board member of the Review of Metaphysics and New Polity, a journal of post-liberal thought. His book publications include Freedom from Reality, The Diabolical Character of Modern Liberty, and Retrieving Freedom, The Christian Appropriation of Classical Tradition. Both of those are published by Notre Dame Press. Dr. Favale is professor of the practice in theology and literature at the McGrath Institute for Church Life at the University of Notre Dame. A Catholic convert with an academic background in gender studies, Abigail writes and speaks regularly on topics related to women and gender from a Catholic perspective. Her best-selling book, The Genesis of Gender, A Christian Theory, published by Ignatius Press, has been translated into 7 languages. She has also published numerous essays in Church Life Journal, The Atlantic, First Things, Public Discourse, Comment, and elsewhere. And then last but definitely not least, we have Dr. DeGirolami, the St. John Henry Newman Professor of Law and co-director of the Center for Law and the Human Person here at Catholic University of America. His publications include The Tragedy of Religious Freedom, Harvard University Press, articles in the Yale Law Journal, Notre Dame Law Review, Washington University Law Review, Constitutional Commentary, Legal Theory, and the Boston College Law Review, among others. He's also written in popular press for the New York Times, the New Republic, First Things, Commonweal, and Law and Liberty. So please join me in welcoming this very distinguished panel.
Thank you, everyone. Just for logistics, I'm going to ask each of the speakers to come up and just share some thoughts, each of them about 15 minutes or so, and then we'll have a discussion among the panelists, and then we'll open it up and can't wait to field your questions. So, okay.
So good morning. It's a real privilege to be here. I'm grateful for the invitation. So our panel, as you've heard, is meant to open up a discussion about the culture of self-invention with a view to the larger question of religious liberty. And the culture of self-invention, I think we all have a pretty immediate sense of what that means. It's a culture that essentially rebels against the various givens of human existence, things like nature, tradition, institution, authority, and the like. And in contrast, in opposition, really, as I want to suggest to these things, affirms the right to define oneself according to one's will. Now, my role in this, as I understand it, is to try to bring out the philosophical presuppositions of this culture so that we can begin to think about it in a fruitful way. And I think it's fairly obvious that at the foundation of this culture of self-invention lies a particular interpretation of human freedom, the nature of human freedom. So I think it's an important task to scrutinize what we might call the conventional notion of freedom that reigns in our contemporary culture. Now, this discussion, if we acquire a certain sense of what human freedom is, that's also going to obviously illuminate the question of religious liberty. Clearly, religious liberty, how we conceive of religious liberty, has a lot to do with how we conceive of liberty simply. So let's start with the conventional notion of freedom and think about what it implies. I think it's fairly easy to grasp the basic characteristics because this conception of freedom is so pervasive in our culture. But one of the most recent examples, I think, is a nice reference point, is the Democratic National Convention. I don't know how many of you watched any of that, but Oprah Winfrey gave a speech at the convention, and prior to her speech, she played a video clip. She, I guess, produced this short film, the essence of which was she gathered together everyday Americans from every walk of life, and they were asked this question: what is freedom? What does freedom mean? And you saw them sort of thinking it through. So it's very illuminating, and I find it striking. You can watch that video clip. It's worth looking up on YouTube. the very first statement that's made after some pause for reflection, they're taken aback initially by the question. A woman says, "Freedom to me means choice." And then as the the discussion sort of unfolds, you hear other things that we're all very familiar with. You hear things like freedom means being able to be whoever you want to be without constraint, without interference. And that sense of freedom, I think, is what defines the culture of self-invention as we understand it. But it all flows from this fundamental idea that freedom is essentially choice. And that's what I want to think about for a moment. Now, choice, the connection between freedom and choice is an ancient one. It's been there since the very beginning of thought on the matter. One can look at St. Augustine's text on the free choice of the will, one of the original texts in the classical Christian tradition about the meaning of freedom. But what choice means in different contexts, I'd like to suggest to you, and if there were more time, could unfold some of this, but I'd like to suggest to you that the meaning of choice has evolved over time. Now, in lieu of doing a history of that, I just want to draw attention to a basic contrast between what you might call the traditional sense of what choice is and the contemporary sense, the modern sense of what choice is. And in order to do that, I find it really helpful to compare it to an argument that the great Catholic German philosopher Josef Pieper made in a book that I think is maybe familiar to many of you. The book is called Leisure, the Basis of Culture. And it's really a book worthwhile reading. In that book, Pieper draws a distinction. He points to a scholastic idea that there's a fundamental distinction in the order of the intellect. Now, this other human faculty, a distinction between intellectus and ratio. Intellectus is the intellect proper, the mind proper, and the scholastic philosophers understood that as representing the basic activity, the basic operation of the intellect. And they contrasted that to ratio, which was a power that belonged to the intellect, but it was subordinate to intellectus proper. Now, intellectus for the scholastic philosophers meant an immediate perception of the truth of things, an immediate intuitive grasp. You behold what is. You behold the self-evidence of truth. It's essentially contemplative, Pieper says. Ratio, by contrast, is reasoning power, discursive reasoning, moving from A to B to C, thinking through the relationships among things. Now, for scholastic philosophy, ratio was at the service of intellectus. Aquinas compared ratio and intellectus to the relationship between movement and rest. You begin from a point of rest, you move, and then return to a point of rest. And the way the mind operates is you have a fundamental insight into what is true, and then you reason on the basis of that, make further inferences, but you then come back to an insight into what's true. That's how the scholastic philosophy understood the activity of the intellect. Now, what Pieper says in this book is one of the best ways that we can characterize the ethos of modernity is to understand it as having reversed the priority and made ratio the most decisive activity of the intellect. And in fact, in a certain sense, the only one. We reduce the intellect to ratio. So we think of the intellect as simply this discursive power of reasoning and demonstration and making arguments and so forth. And we take the moment of insight to be something sort of subjective. It's interesting, if you look at the word intuition, in the ancient philosophy that meant the mind's direct perception of reality. But now intuition tends to mean something like a gut feeling, something that's very subjective and in a certain sense arbitrary. Now, I would like to suggest that you could make a similar argument about the will. In fact, I think it's even more revealing of the nature of modern culture. Aquinas, in a perfect parallel with the intellectus ratio distinction, Aquinas makes a distinction between voluntas, which is the will properly speaking, and liberum arbitrium, the power of free choice, and says that these relate to each other in the same way that intellectus and ratio relate to each other. So what does this mean? Voluntas in scholastic philosophy, and representing really the classical tradition here, voluntas is intellectual appetite, is what Aquinas calls it. But what that means is it is our desire for the good in its truth. That's what the will is. The will is this given desire for the good. And that, according to scholastic philosophy, was taken as the context, the established, given, presupposed context within which free choice makes sense. Given that we have this desire that's built into us for the good, our free choice determines, in our judgment, what the best means is to pursue that good. And that's how the will works. So Aquinas, following Aristotle, points out that free choice always concerns means. It never concerns ends. We don't choose our end. We take an end as given, and we choose the means to pursue that. If we do, in fact, try to choose an end, choose a purpose, that choice is always going to be made on the basis of some other end that we're presupposing. So it's impossible, in fact, from the classical perspective, to choose one's goal, to choose one's end. There's always something that's given as the context within which it makes sense. Now, it seems to me, if we take that I've sketched out very sort of simply, if we think about the cultural implications of these two conceptions, we see that it's enormous, the implications. In the classical tradition, desire for the good precedes and makes sense of our choice. In modernity, free choice has been disembedded from the desire for the good. It's been absolutized and removed from any context. Now, what does this mean culturally speaking? If you think about, for the classical tradition, precisely because voluntas was recognized as principle, as foundational, all of the things in human existence that establish a given context, things like your nature, your culture, where you were born, ultimately even your religion, the religion to which you belong. All of these things were understood as being part of our freedom. The very fact that we're rooted in these things, that's part of our freedom. That strengthens our freedom. That gives, in a way, enables us to make choices in a confident and robust sort of way. By contrast, in a culture where liberum arbitrium has been abstracted, disembedded from this context of desire for the good, anything that impinges on our choice, anything that even really influences us from the outside, is taken to be a threat to our freedom. And in order to be free, we need to either get rid of those things or somehow try to reconceive them as functions of our choice. And this is something I think we have quite a bit of evidence for. So let me take as an example. You think of marriage as an institution. When one gets married, a bond is established. And within that, once that bond is established, it's very obvious that the range of our choices has been curtailed in a significant way. I mean, not only in the obvious way that now you're stuck with this particular person, but an infinite number of choices: where you live, what you eat, what you can do with your free time. There are all sorts of things that curtail your power to choose. Right now. In the modern contemporary context, if one wants to try to reconcile those sorts of obligations with freedom, how does one do that? What do we do? It seems to me typically what one does is says, okay, sure, marriage implies all of these obligations and responsibilities, but you chose to get married. Nobody forced you to get married. That was your free choice, and these are just the implications of your choice. And when we recognize that, we can see that there's a compatibility, you see, between freedom as choice and the obligations of marriage. Now, I think that's a disastrous strategy or way of thinking. There are enormous problems with that. I'm just going to mention 3 of them that are immediately obvious, but one can really unfold that. First of all, notice how that way of trying to reconcile something like the obligations of marriage with choice, you reconcile it precisely by reinterpreting all of those obligations in the terms of choice. You think of them as belong to our freedom only because we've chosen them. So you're reinforcing this idea that freedom is all about choice and really nothing but choice. You reinforce that, and that has implications. Secondly, one of the most immediate implications is, think about this. If the essence of the matter is choice, it may be the case that I've bound myself in this moment through the choice of getting married, but there's nothing about the bond that couldn't be trumped by a later choice. You see, the bond itself becomes something totally arbitrary and empty. If choice is the point, why can't I just choose to disregard what I chose yesterday? And as one begins to think about that, you see that nothing really then can have any claim on my freedom. If it's all about choice, even the choice that I'm making right now means nothing to me a second later unless I reconfirm it with choice. I end up sort of lifting myself up into cultural outer space without anything to connect with, anything that kind of gives me direction. There's a kind of emptiness here that I want to come back to in a moment. And then the third problem that's evident there is that in distinction from marriage, there are many, and again, a virtual infinity of things that we are connected to that we can't reinterpret as a matter of choice, that are always going to be simply givens. Our nature, the family that we were born into, the time and place that we were born into, the religion we were born into, all of these things are not at all things that we've chosen. From the classical tradition, from the perspective of the classical tradition, precisely because we have not chosen those things, they anchor and make possible our choices. There's something about belonging to those and cultivating one's rootedness and attachment to these things that actually enables us to make good human choices, you see. Whereas from this other perspective, those things always have to be somehow neutralized or canceled out or removed in order to liberate this very abstract sort of power. Now, I'm almost at the end here. It seems to me very clear, it doesn't require much reflection to see how this notion of freedom as disembedded choice, as arbitrary power to choose, is really what's behind a culture of self-invention. The notion that what's most important to me is simply what I've chosen for myself. That's what's most important to me. That's what most defines me. I think it's difficult to actually call this a culture if that's what's driving it, because a culture implies a shared mode of existence, and there's nothing in that conception that can really be shared. The only thing that can be shared is an ideology. And the content of that ideology is something that runs contrary to all sharing in principle. I think this is more of an anti-culture than a culture. And there's something poisonous about it. And this leads me to the very last observation I'd like to make, which I think is maybe not so obvious on the surface and might even seem counterintuitive initially, but that observation is this: there's a kind of self-undermining logic that's built into this conception of freedom and that's built into this culture. Self-undermining in the sense that the logic of it contradicts itself and renders it quite unstable, to say the least. On the surface, this idea of unbridled power to choose would seem like a very powerful conception of freedom. But the very thing that makes it appear powerful, I'd like to suggest, renders it vulnerable and needy and really impotent, and that is its detachment from reality. This conception of freedom, in a way, has nothing real to support it. There's nothing that is given that everybody, in a way, automatically, naturally recognizes as true and valid, that is just simply shared and given, that supports this notion of freedom. So what happens? There's a drive in this culture to seek to compensate for that lack of substance and lack of reality. So there's a drive to constantly win public recognition and acceptance, to get legal protection, this sort of artificial propping it up through legal protections, through public recognition. There's this built-in despair in it. The constant appeal to a kind of victimhood, an impotence, a powerlessness in the face of things. That's ironically the very flip side of the very same notion that freedom is power. Power understood as a separation from the reality of things. So I think we'll be unfolding some dimensions of this in the areas of gender and religious liberty directly, but I think that's a conception of freedom that underlies the whole thing. And to put it in a nutshell, I think the best way to formulate this conception of freedom is that it's a freedom from reality. It's a freedom from reality. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much for inviting me to be here. Thank you for those remarks, which kind of tee up a little bit what I'm about to talk about. So in my 15 minutes here, I'd like to focus on one key aspect of the culture of self-invention, namely shifting conceptions of gender, or what it means to be or not to be a man or a woman. So first, I want to kind of give a little bit of the lay of the land. So as I see it, there are two primary theories of gender on offer in our culture right now. So one I will call gender constructionism, and then the other I will call gender subjectivism. So let me just give a brief overview of each of those theories. So first, constructionism. So you run into this theory anytime you hear someone say something like, gender is a social construct, right? So that's a very common thing to hear, especially if you're talking to young people. So this understanding of gender emerged from feminist theory. So in second wave feminist theory, there was a distinction between sex as a biological fact and then gender, which is more the kind of cultural expression of sexual difference. So in this kind of classic framing, gender is a social construct, whereas sex is seen as a kind of given or a biological fact. Now that kind of neat distinction in the late 80s and 90s shifted again as feminist theory and gender theory, especially in the legacy of Judith Butler, began to interrogate sex itself as a construct, right? So in Butler's early theory, she basically concludes that sex is a construct of the process of gender, right? So not just gender, but biological sex itself. Our inclination to kind of read the empirical facts of reality and conclude that there are these discrete categories, this binary, is itself a construction of culture. So in constructionism then, neither sex or gender are real. They are constructs of language and cultural power. So, and they're not great either. They're not seen as these positive constructs, but they're oppressive. Okay, they're something to be deconstructed, something that we need to free ourselves from. So in constructionism, to put it simply, gender is something extrinsic to the self. It has its origin in culture. It is artificial, right? And it's oppressive. Okay, so that's constructionism. On the other hand, we have gender subjectivism. So you might run into gender subjectivism when you hear something like, gender is who I feel myself to be, or gender is an innate sense of self, or gender identity is sometimes a phrase that's kind of a shorthand for a subjectivist viewpoint. So gender subjectivism emerged from gender constructionism. So in my kind of reading of how this worked, I think the anti-realism of gender constructionism paved the way for a kind of new or pseudo-realism to emerge, a kind of new essentialism of the self that is rooted in subjective sense of self rather than culture, or certainly rather than the organization of the body. So gender subjectivism, I would say, became mainstream around 2013, 2014. I don't know if you remember when Facebook just suddenly had like 40 genders to choose from. Like, whoa, where'd all those come from, right? So I think there's something actually in kind of the environment of social media in the early 2000s that almost generated an understanding of gender as almost totally disembodied. But to put it simply and to contrast it with constructionism, gender, according to subjectivist theory, is intrinsic rather than extrinsic, right? It's deeply innate and part of the self. It is authentic, it's who I really am. This sense of self that I have is who I really am. So it's not artificial, it's authentic. And it's liberating, it's good. Gender's great, it's something to be expressed and celebrated and embraced. And so these are really contrasting views, right? Extrinsic, intrinsic, artificial, authentic, oppressive, liberating. Right? So these are really different, I would say, contradictory views of gender. But what makes our contemporary context complex is that there has not been a clean break between these theories. So instead, what we see in the contemporary landscape is a constant equivocation between these two views. Right? So and sometimes you might even hear someone use gender as a social construct and then pivot to an innate sense of self, sometimes in the same sentence. One good example of this, I think, are the current Associated Press guidelines for writers to use when they're writing about gender in news coverage. So they give the following definition of gender at one point in the guidelines. Gender is a social construct, ding, okay, we got some constructionism there, encompassing a person's behaviors, intrinsic identity, and appearance, right? How can gender be a social construct and an intrinsic identity, right? I mean, you could try to steelman that a little bit and say, well, maybe we internalize social constructs and they become kind of an intrinsic identity. But no, intrinsic means pre-social, right? This really doesn't make sense. Moreover, people who embrace gender subjectivism, they actually might claim that this concept of gender might be at odds with your socialization, right? So a young boy who realizes he's a girl, he's been socialized as a boy, he's male, but this realization of his intrinsic girlness is actually a pre-social given, right? So I really do think we're dealing with two different conceptions here. Now back to the guidelines. So that first we have this kind of valiant attempt to like shoehorn both constructivism and subjectivism into one definition of gender. But then to make it even more complicated, later on in the guidelines, there's a definition of gender identity that's given, which is a person's sense of feeling male or female or both or neither, right? That's subjectivism 101 there. And then the guidelines say, often just gender will suffice, right? So very confused landscape, right? And it's complicated too because in the legal landscape, it's this concept of gender as subjective identity that is being attempted to kind of fold into the definition of sex in the law. So it's really important, I think, to realize that these are two kind of contradictory understandings of what grounds what it means to be a man and what it means to be a woman. Okay, so now I want to shift a little bit into analyzing these two theories. And I'll call this section of my remarks Two Half-Truths and a Lie. So first, what's true about constructionism? Well, some norms and expressions of sexual difference are culturally mediated and constructed in a certain sense. They're not strictly natural, right? The way that we're dressed, for example. By and large, the women in the room are dressed a little bit differently than the men, okay? And exactly what those fashion norms are kind of elaborations of culture, right? And the church sometimes uses this language. So for example, in the 2019 Vatican document from the then, I can't remember the name now, the something of education, which is now the dicastery, yeah, okay, you know what I'm talking about. So their document on gender theory from 2019 discusses how it's possible, when rightly interpreted, to make a distinction between sex as a biological category and the kind of living out or the cultural expression of sexual difference, right? So correctly interpreted, that distinction is helpful, as long as it's not seen as a complete separation, right? So here we have kind of a certain truth in constructionism, I think, that can be helpful. And then what's the glimmer of truth in subjectivism? Well, there is a subjective dimension to the human person. Humans are persons with complex interiority, subjectivity, freedom. And we also see this language sometimes reflected in the magisterium, especially through John Paul II's kind of personalist language. And he uses the phrase self-determination, which, if not correctly understood, almost seems like a phrase that comes from the culture of self-invention, right? So I'll be talking a little bit more about what John Paul II means by that in a little bit. So both constructionism and subjectivism grasp at something true about the human person. The social and subjective dimensions of gender are real because we are socially embedded and also self-conscious beings. The problem arises when, in each of these theories, those aspects of our anthropology are extracted away and become absolute. So the shared lie of both of these theories is the deconstruction of sexual difference as a natural reality, the loss of the real, the ground of human nature. So that's what they both have in common. Constructionism and subjectivism actively deconstruct the reality of sexual difference. So put differently, both of these theories downplay or reject the objective dimension of our sexed human nature. So I want to conclude with a little bit of discussion about John Paul II's personalism, because I think it might be something of a resource for us in our time. So John, and it's wonderful we're in the shrine here. Like, I didn't quite make that connection when I prepared for this, that we're in John Paul II's shrine. So hopefully he approves of my articulation of his philosophy. All right, so John Paul II's philosophical anthropology, I'll describe it as realist personalist. So it's realist in the sense that he affirms basically a Thomistic realism. We, as human beings, visibly and physically belong to the realm of creation, to the objective realm. We are objects in creation in that sense. And yet his personalism emphasizes that there is also an interior, subjective dimension to the human person that is unique and unrepeatable, that is characterized by consciousness, freedom, interiority. Now, this subjective dimension is not contrary to our objective nature, but part of it. Our human subjectivity is part of our objective essence as human beings. We are material and spiritual composites. So I am both a subject, but also an object in the world. So to know myself truly is to know myself as a subject-object totality, to be able to apprehend my nature as a human being, as a woman, in an objective way, as a creature among other creatures. But yet I also have a certain experience of my interiority as a subject. Now, a central concept in his personalism, JP2's personalism, is self-determination, which I mentioned earlier. And at first glance, you know, this kind of like my spidey signals are up a little bit. Self-determination, I don't know about that. But self-determination, for John Paul II, is neither relativist nor subjectivist, but anchored in a transcendent understanding of goodness and truth. Our subjectivity enables us to act in pursuit of the good, or not. And how we act in that moral sphere, how we exercise our freedom, profoundly shapes us. Put simply, our freely chosen acts shape who we become. If you do good things over and over and over, eventually you become a good person. And if you do evil things over and over and over and over, you become evil. So in this sense, we really have a profound power to form ourselves or deform ourselves. But this is not an absolute power unconstrained by our nature. In fact, our capacity to form ourselves depends upon our nature, namely the range of potentialities within our nature that can be actualized or brought to fruition. So these natural potentialities both open the possibilities for our becoming, our development, but also constrain them. So there is a sense in which we shape who we become, but we cannot change the givens, the range of possible potentialities with which we are endowed by nature. We cannot become other than what we are by nature, except, of course, through grace, but again, grace builds upon, not destroys nature. John Paul II describes subjectivism as the absolutization of the experiential aspect. And I think that's a really good description of what we see in our time. In other words, the extraction of one component of a complete anthropology away from the whole structure of human personhood. So subjectivism amputates the subjective from the objective and is thus an effacement of the human person rather than a truthful disclosure. But there's a temptation, I think, in our current moment to respond to subjectivism, especially gender subjectivism, by leaning heavily into objective reality, right? Okay, sexual difference exists, XY chromosome, blah, 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 right? And kind of minimizing the subjective dimension. Like, well, how you feel about yourself doesn't matter, okay? And I understand that impulse. And emphasizing objective reality is really important. But I think a truly Catholic response is to embrace both, rightly understood, to offer a complete anthropology that incorporates both the subjective and objective dimensions of human personhood. So I wonder if perhaps there is a kind of opportunity here in terms of formation or even evangelization to not wholly just like push back against the concept of self-invention, but to rather take what's true about it and to reground it in the real and the good. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for having me, and I'm grateful to be able to address this audience. I'm new at the law school, and I'm looking forward to many happy years of working together with the folks in this room. I thought that I might give a little tour of the legal horizon over the last 50 or 60 years of the law of religious freedom. I think that you will see some continuities with respect to some of what my co-panelists have said, as well as some of the introductory comments of Bishop Rhoades. Some people believe it to be mourning in America for religious freedom. And if one looked only at the win-loss record at the Supreme Court, one might feel that way, but I think that there are some problems, and those problems relate to some of the themes of this conference. So, what was religious freedom in America before, say, 1985? The Supreme Court's principal project was to dismantle, bit by bit, what I've called the soft Christian establishment that had dominated the cultural landscape. Public prayers, symbols, expressions, Sunday closing laws, joint partnerships of religious, civic, and state organizations, public systems of financial support for religious institutions, all of these and more reflect what we could call the soft Christian establishment. The doctrine of strict separationism, strict separation of church and state, was the jackhammer that would smash up that existing state of affairs. And by about the mid-1980s, the success of that demolition project changed things and was responsible, I think, for changing the nature of religious freedom in America. The new religious freedom responded to a new problem with two faces. Number one, the increasing religious pluralism in America. And number two, the civic void that the Supreme Court and other powerful actors had created by dismantling the old Christian establishment. The new doctrine would impose some descriptive or evaluative ordering on the growing disorder of American religious pluralism, because it was now thought necessary to make sense of the religion clauses, the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause, through some principled account of how these work together to advance the fundamental aims of the American polity. And in my view, the new regime was set according to broadly liberal understandings. The new approach was supported by 3 pillars. Number 1, the firm separation between the religious and the secular. Number 2, rigorous state neutrality toward particular religious traditions and religion generally. And number 3, the advisability of, and sometimes a constitutional demand for, religious exemption from general laws to accommodate the welcome fact of religious pluralism. As the law developed, as time passed, each of these 3 pillars began to crack, and religious liberty began to lose coherence. Often enough, the pressures that brought about the collapse were internal to the ambition to impose order on the disorder of pluralism, to reconstruct a kind of substitute along liberal foundations to fill the emptiness that followed the deconstructed political establishment. The first death was of the word, and the word was religion. The degradation in the legal meaning of religion was effectuated by a pincer movement of disestablishmentarian and free exercise doctrine. Establishment Clause law, as I've mentioned, was meant to break up the existing soft Christian establishment. But free exercise clause law played a role also, because religion in the new dispensation was no longer conceived as a substantive system of common belief and practice, but instead as an individual preference, one that, in the words of one Supreme Court case, quote, need not be acceptable, logical, consistent, or comprehensible, close quote, to anybody. Unacceptable, illogical, inconsistent, incomprehensible. These are not words that one typically associates with desirable human phenomena that are worthy of preservation, let alone constitutional protection. But that is what religion in American law became. And that project has been a success. Religion in American law has become opaque by design. The second decaying pillar was the insistence that the state should be neutral toward religion and that it should maintain a division between the realm of private belief and choice, religion, and the realm of public deliberation and action, secularism or non-religion. But notice, once religion was liquidated, it became impossible to be neutral toward it. It would be like insisting that the government should be neutral toward politics, with this important exception. Unlike political non-neutrality, religious non-neutrality can be invoked selectively in order to achieve some other type of purpose. And those purposes, I believe, often concern the ideological or political content of the law rather than its form as religious or not religious. Let me give you one example. An exchange in the oral argument in Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization, in which the court, as you will know, ultimately struck down the Roe and Casey regime constitutionalizing a right to abortion. Quote, "How is your interest anything but a religious view?" Close quote. Justice Sotomayor asked advocates for the state. Quote, "The issue of when life begins has been hotly debated by philosophers since the beginning of time. It is still debated in religions. So when you say this is the only right that takes away from the state the ability to protect a life, that is a religious view, isn't it?" Close quote. As a formal matter, Dobbs had nothing to do with the religion clauses. Nobody argued that the Mississippi law violated the Establishment Clause. But Justice Sotomayor invoked religion in a different way, tactically, in order to portray the ideological or political content of the law as religiously motivated and therefore illegitimate because non-neutral as to religion. But notice, this kind of argument makes little sense after the liquefying of religion. And so the result is a kind of arbitrary on-off switch quality to accusations of religious non-neutrality that can be deployed strategically to charge political views with which one disagrees as being illegitimate in form, while insulating one's own views from such criticism. The third decaying pillar is the conviction that there is a constitutional mandate, or failing that, a legislative requirement to grant exemptions from general laws to everybody who objects to them on the basis of sincere religious scruple. Over the last generation, religious exemption has become, I think, the single most contentious issue in the law of religious freedom, because it is in frequent tension with some of the bedrock sociocultural creeds of the new establishment. It turns out that, once again, an instrument that it was hoped could solve the problem of rampaging religious pluralism in America by creating an alternative civic foundation, a liberal foundation of autonomy-inflected religious freedom for all, has proved ineffective. On the doctrinal front, trouble has come in some of the most recent elaborations of religious exemption law in the COVID-19 cases and a case called Fulton versus City of Philadelphia. I will pass over those. We can talk about those in the Q&A if you wish. But notice also in the culture, one often hears, including from virtuous religious liberty advocacy organizations, that religious exemptions are required because we need, quote, religious freedom for all, close quote, so that the right of religious freedom is not perceived by the public to be captured by particular political or cultural constituencies. But it is doubtful, I would like to suggest, that religious freedom for all is either a feasible or a desirable aspiration. It is difficult to conceive of too many things more destructive of the civic fabric than a constitutional right not to obey the law for religious reasons under conditions where religion has dissolved into a kind of gelatinous nothingness of personal political preference. One of the latest fronts in this war is the case of claimants who argue that the state burdens their religious freedom unless it exempts them from restrictions on abortion. Plaintiffs in several cases have argued that their state's new restrictions on abortion, made possible after Dobbs, violate their religious freedom. A footnote here. In preparing this talk, I did a little research. In 1991, virtually everybody supported something called the Religious Freedom Restoration Act and its exceptionally broad conception of religious exemption. That law ultimately passed with overwhelming support by unanimous vote in the House, 97-3 in the Senate, better than the declaration of war after Pearl Harbor. Do you know who opposed the law? The United States Conference of Catholic Bishops. They objected that the law might give abortion rights litigators a new theory to argue. The Bishops' Conference wanted the bill to explicitly reject such claims. Eventually, at a late stage, the conference was jawboned into supporting RFRA. But you were right. You were right. The dangers forecasted by the conference have come to pass. How did we get to this point? Now I'll wrap up. If political liberalism has often been, at form at least, an argument for bracketing the good, that is not how liberalism has developed. It initially aimed to disarm the political authorities from acting for the common good and narrow the scope of legitimate government to what might be said to be neutral grounds. And yet what has emerged is a philosophy that sees autonomy as the basic good and limits on autonomy and self-invention as injustices. If we consider the argument for abortion in the name of religious freedom, we will recognize that sexual autonomy looms large because cultural, moral, and religious traditions have always imposed restrictions on sexual acts, restrictions that liberalism is hardwired to deem anathema, except to the extent that they may be justified in the service of autonomy. On this view, the liberation of sexual acts from moral standards other than consent, which is required by autonomy, is a very great good, even a religiously mandated good. That is a non-neutral moral commitment. The moral anthropology in play in the religious liberty as abortion or religious liberty as transgender liberation moves seems to understand the autonomous person to be both radically free and yet also entirely dependent on the validation of others, and so utterly vulnerable to the psychosocial harm of their disapproval. That is, the unwillingness of other people to affirm the goodness of one's self-invention, or their often mild dissent from it, is taken to be incompatible with equality and thus an insult which no self-invented person should have to endure. The argument for maximizing self-invention, therefore, and here my comments are going to pick up some of Abigail Favale's very good remarks, it has an equivocal foundation. In some contexts, the point is that one has a right to be utterly free to do as one chooses, with no limits on that freedom. One is a self-inventor. In other contexts, the point is that, like Luther, one can do no other without compromising one's moral integrity. One is the creature of some other kind of inventing force. One truly last thought, then I'll stop.
You're fine. You're good.
What's to be done? What's to be done? Religious liberty at one time was a noble and important ideal. In some ways it still is. How do we save it from its present trouble? I can think of two possible paths. The first would be to continue to play the lawyer's game. The law of religious freedom today may be grounded in falsehood, but it gets the job done. The Catholic Church has been the beneficiary of this legal regime. True, it and others are litigating so often because they're losing so often in the broader American culture. Again, picking up from Bishop Rhoades. But they can at least get something from the self-invented conception of religion. The trouble here is that it is not so good to depend upon false ideas for legal protection or otherwise. You can rely on bad philosophy for a little while to protect you, but in time, bad philosophy is likely to lead to bad outcomes. The second would be, again, picking up from where Abby left off, to take up Veritatis Splendor and to reflect on the state of the world in 1993, the same year that RFRA was passed, in the way that St. John Paul II did. Quote, "It is no longer a matter of limited and occasional dissent, but of an overall and systematic calling into question of traditional moral doctrine on the basis of certain anthropological and ethical presuppositions. At the root of these presuppositions is the more or less obvious influence of currents of thought which end by detaching human freedom from its essential and constitutive relationship to truth," close quote. So the idea here might be to construct a definition of religion with greater substance in relation to truth. That could be done in a number of ways, limiting it to particular traditions or systems of belief or phenomenological qualities, size, for example, or groupishness, curtailing its scope to give it more moral and legal coherence. The trouble here is, A, the Supreme Court seems utterly disinclined to adopt this approach, and B, getting the courts involved in making pronouncements about what counts as true religion and what does not, at least in this culture, is not without considerable dangers of its own. Thank you.
Panel, when you need to speak, put your mics on. Terrific. Thank you for those remarks. There is so much there, as I'm sure all of you have many questions yourself. I want to start first just by asking each of you on the panel to talk a little bit more about this question of givens, because that seems to be a common thread here, that what we're seeing in the culture is this rejection of givens or self-evident truths, even taking it back. How much of this really comes back to a rejection of the giver? In other words, is this so intimately tied with the decline of religion? And therefore, is that going to herald something for us about how we get back to a sense of respect for the givens? And I have more questions on givens, but just first that threshold question. Do you see the connection of rejecting givens to sort of a larger, simultaneous perhaps, or preceding rejection of the giver? You have to turn it on. Yeah.
Test, yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely, yeah, there would be a connection. And I think it's, I rather than characterize it in the first place as a decline of religion, I think prior to the decline of religion is a reconception of what religion is, and a lot of this has come up already. And this bears immediately on the question that you raised, Mary, that according to the Christian tradition, God loved us before we loved Him. So it's of the very essence of the generosity of God that He's always already from the beginning involved us in a relationship with Him. And it seems to me that is the starting point for recognizing things like that. That gives a positive quality to givenness. There's a generosity there. There's a love there. There's a liberation that's built into what's given from this perspective. It seems to me the problem is with a kind of political liberalism that precisely, one can go into the history of why this was the case, but precisely to try to avoid the danger of what was called religious violence, but that's actually a much more complicated thing, historically speaking, than we realize. We find dangerous and threatening the idea that God made a bond with us prior to our ability to choose. And so we reconceive that precisely. God now becomes choice, an object of choice. And once that's really fundamental. And the reason this is an important question is if that's true, then in order to deal with the various problems that we're discussing, we really do have to reckon with this fundamental idea that the only way to have a peaceful political situation is by a kind of neutrality with respect to what's ultimate. I just don't think that I think it's become clear that doesn't work, and because that's been taken for granted for so long, dealing with the implications of that are going to be require a lot of time and suffering, even, and imagination. But it seems to me we really need to address it at that level.
Okay, great. Abby?
I mean, I think in your first question, the rejection of givens being connected to the rejection of the giver, I think that's absolutely true in the sense that we no longer think of ourselves as creatures and being created, but instead we are the creators. But I also think a piece of the puzzle is technology. Mm-hmm. I think especially in the realm of gender, the conceptual revolutions that we've been talking about are intertwined with technological revolutions, such that the technologies on offer shape how we understand the self, how we understand sexual difference. I think one of the most profound technologies that has shaped this particular aspect of the discussion is contraception, in the sense that, well, there's a lot of senses, but because my brain is now suddenly thinking about, oh, that's so interesting. Like, I wonder how much contraception actually has not just reshaped our rejection of the gift of sexual difference, but also our rejection of our creatureliness in a more expansive way, in that our capacity for procreation is a mirror or a kind of distant image of God's own creative generosity, right? So I think there's some profound implications there. That was sort of a tangent. But I think, especially when we think about men and women, I think the technology of contraception has profoundly reshaped our cultural imagination, just in terms of what is the ground of the distinction between men and women, which used to, I think, just be intuitively understood as a distinction of generative capacities, right? A woman has the potential to be a mother, a man has the potential to be a father. But once we kind of use technology to sever that connection, I think that the procreative potential receded in our cultural imagination and then shifted to much more of a focus on appearance, more of a focus on roles, things that actually are kind of malleable in a certain way. And so the technology of hormonal contraception, that was the same technology that developed, for example, the use of cross-sex hormones to masculinize and feminize the body. So those two technologies had a shared origin, right? So I also think that our technological focus is part of the denaturalization. Like our nature seems malleable, right? In a way that it just never has. Like the kinds of technologies that are on offer now in terms of, say, masculinizing a female person and vice versa, just are unthinkable in earlier eras. So the kinds of things we're able to do technologically, I think also feed into this idea that we can create ourselves. We are the creators. We don't have givens because the limits, we can mess with the limits. We can push past the limits. And that, in fact, maybe is what makes us most human, right? Like kind of this existentialist understanding of the human person. So yeah, I think the technological piece, though, is definitely part of the mix.
Mary, in your initial question, you talked about givens and or a giver, and I think it probably is true that as an original matter, the religious liberty in this country was conceived as, for many people, including James Madison, as the duty we owe to our Creator, which goes to some of the concepts of invention, self-invention, and other inventedness, of creatureliness, and so on. But I think that we've, as I had mentioned, we've drifted quite a good distance, and in addition to some of the religious liberty as abortion controversies or religious liberty as transgender controversy, it just raised one other one. The fastest growing, quote unquote, religious group in the United States is the nuns, N-O-N-E-S, who are prototypically self-invented, a self-invented religious group. That's the part of the point. Whatever it is that binds them, which isn't much, other than what Dave mentioned as choice, is the freedom constantly to create a kind of bricolage or cafeteria-style religion, and to change that from day to day. So I think it might be that that group in particular, if it does start to make more frequent religious freedom claims, and I don't see any reason why it shouldn't, will create some kind of pressure point and squeeze the law in such a way as to require some kind of turn. Now, whether that turn can be in the direction of natural religion of one kind or another is uncertain for some of the reasons that I mentioned, but it's at least a possibility worth thinking about, and perhaps an opportunity worth taking up.
Great. Abigail, when you were talking about technology, I often think about that because it seems like it's the next frontier, right? If you view yourself as the autonomous self and your freedom is conquering the next frontier, technology enables that. So it puts it right out there. And I direct this to you, Abigail, and then invite the others to chime in. What would incentivize, for example, one of your students who has bought into this subjectivist conception of self, how I feel is who I am, I decide what's true today could be different tomorrow. What incentivizes them to begin to recognize the givens, to begin to see that their happiness is somehow going to be connected to discovering that there is a truth about themselves, about human nature, about how things work? Like, how do you even have that conversation in real life? How do you move people from who've taken on board the idea that anything given is oppressive? And I saw a news article a couple of days ago about a woman who was expressing outrage that parents are naming children in the delivery room, or when the child is born, that is an act of violence, oppressive violence, because you are constraining that child's choices. So, there's no willingness to see givenness as anything but oppressive. So how do you broach that?
Well, I guess at first I would say that I think most young people I encounter aren't committed ideologues on these questions. I think they are more like what Bishop Rhoades kind of described in his opening remarks, in the sense of being disembedded, in the sense of being rootless and anxious, looking for some kind of sure ground, and then kind of anxiously trying to construct a sense of self in order to hold on to something and feel a sense of security. So in that sense, I think they're looking for what they should be looking for. They're just not looking in the right place, right? So I think there's a way to connect to those desires, reconnect them to the givens. And everything, and I think having sympathy for them in the sense that everything in our culture is driven to make them feel that way, like especially consumerism, right? Like how the best consumer is someone possessed with a sense of restless desire and not knowing what to do with it, right? Like, oh, well, here, use this product. This will help. This product. This will help, right? So I think with those students, I think there's in some ways a little more hope, because they're not kind of ideologically committed to the idea that limits are bad. They're just lost. Now, when it comes to the students who are more ideologically committed to the sense of limits being bad or kind of violence, I think my tactic is usually to try to find a value that they still hold deeply. Because I actually don't think, I think most people aren't like true relativists or true nihilists, at the root. You get some of those, but so to find a value that they still hold true, and then to kind of get them to see that they hold that, get them to see that there is kind of some kind of absolute that they cling on to, or to kind of tease out perhaps some of the downstream consequences of the stance they're taking that would contradict one of their deeply held values. So just to here's one sort of example. So the deeply held value of consent, which is actually what you were talking about in a way, that the idea of autonomy is like a baseline kind of moral absolute. Like it's not neutral in that sense. So to maybe ask a question, something like, okay, well, if consent is kind of the lone or primary moral criteria, like what about a woman who's in an abusive relationship but she consents to it? Like that might make them feel kind of weird, of course, because they, domestic abuse, violence against women, bad, strong moral intuition there. But yet also a strong moral intuition that whatever you consent to is good, right? So finding some kind of like contradiction in their thought to kind of force them to maybe realize. So those are, I guess, the ways in which I might try to, often unsuccessfully, I'll say, get at students who do, or young people who are really kind of ideologically committed on these questions.
David, you had talked about it being a tyranny when you reject reality, that you end up actually being enslaved. And I wonder if you could talk about just the burden that puts on people. I'm struck by the fact that so many of our young people are just enslaved by anxiety. It's like they think they have choices about things which they really don't have choices about, right? Where they're born, the fact that they're male or female, but because they're told they have choices in all of these areas, that seems to be a burden.
That's right. I mean, at the center, then you have a void that needs to be filled, and it's the individual is left alone to fill that, and that's exhausting. I mean, and it's also essentially hopeless, because I think according to the logic that I was talking about, it's impossible to fill it, because absolutely everything that you draw into that black hole becomes a void too. So it by its very nature, there's a kind of despair, and then that leads to being entirely at the mercy of the forces of the culture, from various directions, ideological, market forces, political ideologies, as they say, I mean, one becomes entirely helpless. And I really loved Abigail's remarks there about how to deal with students. I think that she hit exactly the central points. I think in challenging, pointing, education is part of this. Pointing out how hopeless this is in its essence, and how vulnerable it makes one, and the idea that the very flip side of making everything a matter of choice is being helplessly subjected to the choices of others. I was thinking of a cartoon I saw the other day of a woman a pregnant woman at her doctor's who just finished the ultrasound, and she asked the doctor, so is it a boy or a girl? And the doctor said, let's let the second grade teacher decide that. And I mean, that's the point. You become entirely at the mercy of something that is meaningless, really.
Yeah. So I want to talk about language and the problem we have that so many essential terms are disconnected from reality, whether freedom, truth, good, religion, as Marc was mentioning. So I want to get to that, but first I want to come to you, Marc, with your, just in terms of your remarks, 2 questions. One, that demolition project that we saw in the 50s, 40s, 50s, since Everson, 40s, 50s, 60s, of just de-Christianizing the country. I'm struck by the passivity of our country. And I wonder sometimes whether, as I was growing up in the 60s, and it seemed like people were bending over backwards as Catholics to integrate into the society and to embrace the pluralism and embrace all of this. And it seems almost like believers were sidelined. This wasn't just the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court was making those decisions, but people went along with it, and people censored themselves. People stopped, it became something that was unacceptable to talk about religion in public. In other words, we sort of acquiesced to that, don't you think?
Yes.
Or did we?
Yeah, so, in fact, there's probably this is a perennial danger for lawyers, is to hyper-emphasize the importance of law and the court. I do think that the court had played its role, as did powerful political actors. But I'm reminded, Mary, in your question, I was reading, I think, a set of reflections by Stanley Hauerwas, maybe a few years back, who mentioned a story where he was growing up. The single most striking change that he can remember when he was a boy was when the local theater, started showing movies on Sundays. That had never been done before. The showing of movies couldn't do anything on Sunday. Sunday was a day of rest, and all of a sudden, movies started being played on Sundays. And if you think about why that happened, there's probably a confluence of a number of cultural as well as political factors, including market forces of various kinds, economic forces, legal forces, intellectual forces, forces of pluralism. Different constituencies started to come into the country that perhaps wanted to see a movie on Sunday. And so I think it's complicated. That yes, it's true that people acquiesced, but I think people also embraced it because the American people changed, right? The quality of the people changed. Its interests changed. Its cultural preferences changed. And so that, for a variety of reasons, went hand in hand with, in fact, the court couldn't have been otherwise. The court couldn't have done this on its own, but it took a good chance when it saw one.
Yeah. And keep you on the hot seat. Your remarks earlier, you were talking about the difficulty of, for example, saying we should be defending the idea of religious freedom for all, because religion has become this liquefied concept. It's a hobby, it's a preference, it has no objective meaning. And then you also spoke about kind of the unworkability, or suggested that one could see it as unworkable for a system of laws to keep making religious exemptions, right? So how do you square those observations with, for example, dignitatis humanae, the idea that every person has the right to, our duty to God, our conscience rights precede the state, and no one should be coerced in conscience, and that's sort of what that fight is about. It's like telling the government, back off, this is not your realm. We don't want to lose that. So talk to me about that.
So this is a difficult question, and technically outside of my area of expertise. So I will plead ignorance, but as to what dignitatis humanae meant. But I do think it's probably fair to say that the choice-making side of dignitatis humanae has really been picked up in what followed after dignitatis humanae. Dignitatis humanae also has lots of language in it about the obligation of the state to promote the good of religion, whatever the good of religion is, in granting this freedom in the service of truth-seeking. And of course, that in some ways begs the question of what truth is. And we've been talking on this panel about the problems with respect to a culture, a government, a polity in which ideas of truth are also self-invented. But it's not clear to me that that dignitatis humanae necessitated the landing place in which we now find ourselves. In fact, I don't think that it did. Recovering that at this point, recovering that understanding, the original understanding. I'm not an originalist, but if I were, the original meaning of dignitatis humanae, I think is probably an important project. So I probably will stop there. I don't think dignitatis humanae necessitates the kind of culture of self-invention that in which we now find ourselves with respect to religious freedom, because this other component of dignitatis humanae, the responsibility of government to have at least some kind of coherent conception of what the good of religion is for, has been lost.
And I'll let David jump in here, but just to press on that for a second, would you still say that dignitatis humanae, I'm not a Latin scholar, humanae, I defer to your pronunciation, is concerned about that relationship between the person and God and your conscience. And that is something we don't want to get. We don't want the state encroaching upon that. Is there something you see as you see all these pillars crumbling, the three pillars you laid out? How do you protect that then? How do you protect the very real need for people to be able to give God his due in a way that's prior to anything the state would attempt to obligate you to? Or maybe you want to defer to David. Jump in.
Yeah, it seems to me it's helpful to think about this question. I think we spontaneously think the only way that you can protect choice in matters of religion is to step outside of any given tradition. You enter this neutral space towards all religions, and that's what guarantees the capacity to choose. But that actually is the choice of liberalism as the overarching religious view, in fact. It seems to me it's possible, instead of removing yourself from religious tradition in order to protect choice, precisely to draw on the positive resources within the particular religious tradition to protect choice. A kind of an illustration, or sort of an extension of this, is the question, Mary, that you just raised. I mean, think about this. When Catholics baptize a child and raise a child in the context of positively presenting the church as true, does that undermine the child's individual relationship to God? Does that actually compromise the conscience of the child? We would all recognize that's not, I mean, if you think it does, then you've left the Catholic Church and joined, political liberalism as your religion. But we recognize that actually we would want to say it strengthens the child's capacity to make a free choice of God. And if that's true in the family, then it seems to me that puts the political question in different terms. It's not simply the case that the state can only protect choice and conscience by being neutral. That just can't be true.
Okay. All right, to go back to language, and then we'll open it up for questions here. All of you mentioned in one way or another the need to retether language to reality, to the truth. Terms like freedom, truth, good, religion. How do we go about doing that? Is that possible from where we are? So.
I'll just try one thought here, again, drawn in some ways from something that Abigail said. Abigail talked about the habitual quality of habituation, the necessity of practice as a source of strength for the development of a reconnection to, let's say, certain virtues inherent in whatever it might be, the constitutional text, something like this. And I've often thought that this might be a way in. So rather than sort of applying the sort of pointy-headed intellect to the meaning of words, let's say, what do they mean as a matter of principle or something like this, which has led us astray, in my view, a lot of the times, especially when it's Supreme Court justices or others doing this kind of thing. Why not take the meaning of the words to be disclosed through practice by people over long periods of time, and to gain insight about the virtues that our text is meant to protect through what we do rather than what we think.
Okay. David, Abby, any other comments on that? How do we retether language to reality?
So I'm afraid to start talking about this because I'm obsessed with this question. And I don't have an easy answer for it, but I'm obsessed with it because, especially in the realm of gender, there's so much linguistic confusion and manipulation and obfuscation going on. And so prior to becoming Catholic, I spent about a decade kind of immersed in the world of post-structuralist literary theory, where reality is really viewed as a construct of language. Now, I don't think that's true. However, something that the post-structuralists, the postmodernists get right is that the language we use profoundly shapes how we think. It profoundly shapes our view of reality. And so I do think there are those out there kind of acting in bad faith and using that power of language to actively construct a particular vision of reality, to enshrine that in the law, to impose it kind of top down. I think most people are just confused and not necessarily bad faith actors. So I guess one thing I would say is that we have to be really attentive to the language that we use, and to steward language well, to respect its power, and to use it in a way that corresponds with the truth. Now, I think it's complex. I think there are some complexities here, especially in the realm of gender, in terms of pastoral interactions with certain particular individuals. But aside from that, I think it's really important to be intentional about how we use language so as not to unwittingly endorse a false perception of reality, especially in the law. I think clarity of language around sex in the law is so essential. And there's just a lot of funny business going on linguistically in terms of, I think, what, again, those bad faith actors are trying to do, trying to use language in a way that reshapes what's real.
Just a quick comment. I mean, those are lovely remarks, both from Mark and Abigail. But just one little complimentary point is the recognition that language, like just about everything else, begins in the home. And what's called to mind for me is this insight from the theologian Hans Urs von Balthasar. He gives a lot of attention to the phenomenon, he says, of the mother's smile as the moment where a person first comes to consciousness. And that event is pregnant with the whole, one might say. There's something about the reliable presence of the mother in the communication to the child that becomes decisive for the child's own living out of things. In a way, that becomes the paradigm word that's spoken, in relation to which the child begins to understand other words. And when you begin to think about that, you realize how crucially important it is, above all other things in this area and all the others, of recovering the integrity of the family and the health of life in the home as the origin of the culture that then will bear on all of these downstream things like language studies and the law and those kinds of things. It has an origin.
Yeah, great. All right, at this point, we'd like to open it up for questions. There are 2 microphones. We ask you to come up and use them.
Testing.
There you go.
Thanks so much to all of our speakers. I'm Bishop Robert McClory from the Diocese of Gary. Mark, I was glad that you brought up the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. I was in law school at the University of Michigan, and at the time studying under Doug Laycock from 88 to 91. So that's when the Smith case came through, which basically held facially neutral laws that may adversely affect a religious practice are acceptable unless you can show an animus or something specifically targeting religion. Opined, written by Justice Scalia, much admired in many aspects. So our response to this was, while the Religious Freedom Restoration Act was being conceived and discussed, was to do a symposium, not unlike this. We brought in, a Indian Native American chieftain who could talk about peyote use, which was at issue, a congressman who is Jewish by religious background, who was working on the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, Mike McConnell, Doug Laycock, who did a lot of work in religious liberty. And in fact, at the time, I remember the congressman saying he had never seen one issue potentially derail a completely, accepted statutory act as he did with abortion and the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. I think there can be reasons other than that we can kind of apply to this, but now as a bishop in Indiana, we had to sign off on an amicus brief challenging someone who was saying there should be a religious right to abortion. And so indeed, the very fact that you mentioned has come to pass. It does bring up the underlying decision, and this might be more for our afternoon speakers. My observations and questions are going to be a bit more tactical. But when it comes to the Smith decision, which was kind of neutral as to religion, it seems like it is very ripe for being explicitly overturned, and it hasn't happened. And this is where I wonder if legal academia, perhaps from a Catholic perspective, could be of help, because certainly Justice Barish, Justice Barrett, likely Justice Kavanaugh, Robert seems to be an incrementalist, but Barrett is really saying, if we're going to eliminate it, we need a successor, and we don't have it yet. And so I think, they're begging for intellectual, academic options to give to them. Some seem to say you should go back to a strict scrutiny test. So that gets to, does religion have a distinctive role? And I think it does. We have a First Amendment that specifically secures that, but then it opens the window again to, what is religion? So I'm talking a little bit more on the religion side, perhaps less the self-invention side. I think the cases where religion actually was dispositive, you'd probably have to go back to the draft dodger cases in the Vietnam War era. I don't want to be drafted and I have a religious belief. Well, is it religious or is it not? Show me this is a religious belief. So we don't have a whole lot in that. I think then we have the stream when religious liberty was being deconstructed, that free speech rose to the ascendancy. And so under the O'Connor years, if you wanted prayer at a football stadium, you said it was speech and you need to allow speech. And so we kind of lost religion as religion and we replaced it with speech. So I think we're kind of at a moment where this can be perhaps reintroduced, reinserted. My own question, and you brought up the COVID vaccines also, what we were left with were some sincere Catholics who felt that they had a religious objection to that. And the National Catholic Bioethics Center, was kind of really trying to work this out in real time. And essentially the template letter they had was that an individual Catholic could say, I have a right in conscience to do this moral analysis. And as a Catholic, my conclusion is I don't want to be vaccinated. And so you really didn't have Catholic, priests and bishops and pastors signing off that the church is opposed to this, but we signed letters saying this person is Catholic. And the person as a Catholic would say, I've used my intellectual kind of capacity and moral reasoning to say, I don't want this. And so I wonder, these hard cases make bad law, if that kind of, it's not really religious belief, but it's a belief that a religious person can hold because that's how they apply their faith. I think it's gotten a little bit more amorphous. The last one, just because we're talking about self-invention, and maybe this is for afternoon speakers, I wonder, we talk a lot about Roe and Dobbs, but the Casey decision, the famous sort of mystery of life passage, where Justice Kennedy, we have the right to define one's own concept of existence, meaning the universe, and the mystery of human life. It's just kind of like this very amorphous sense of, you can create your own reality, and we think you have a right to that. Whether that's also infiltrated. But so the narrow questions are we at a point where we've kind of allowed religious liberty to really become conscience rights in a way that isn't religion? And also, is there intellectual work being done to get rid of the Smith case in academia so that we can begin to give the justices a replacement?
Thank you.
So these are great questions, and obviously, Bishop, you are very learned in these issues, and you know a lot about them. Just quickly before offering an answer to the questions you ask about, I do think it's true that we're talking about religious liberty and a culture of self-invention, but as some of my co-panelists have mentioned, the self-invention conception in law more generally is ascendant all over the place. It's ascendant in free speech, where the initial conceptions of free speech were oriented toward various political goods, political speech, and so on, constructing a better democratic republic, and as of about the 60s, in just the same way as religion, turned inward. They were all about my right to say what I want to say, my self-expression as the core of free speech. On the issue of Smith, I think there's probably a pretty good division on the kind of Catholic legal scholars front of the people that are pro-Smith, even still, and the people that are anti-Smith. And you're right, I think Justice Barrett has signaled perhaps an interest in getting rid of Smith, but a question about what will replace it. I think if it were so there is some thinking about this going on right now. If it were I doing the thinking, and it isn't, I would probably say be careful what you wish for in getting rid of Smith. I think Smith had some virtue in it that I've come to realize a little bit later, and you don't want to, and this is a danger with, in particular, I may say, somebody like Justice Gorsuch, you don't want to adopt a full-on libertarian understanding of religion, which is probably, I think, the kind of conception on offer. And I would not go in that direction. I wouldn't advocate. I will say something else. It wasn't just religious rights to abortion that the bishops were concerned about. It was things like striking down all tax exemptions that might result as a result of RFRA. Right? It was any kind of cognizance of religion as such as a good that was going to result from this conception. So I would, if it were me, I would proceed with caution before getting rid of Smith. I might tactically say, you know what, Smith isn't so bad, and might do a good bit of work in thinking about who the we of the American constitutional republic is, quite apart from all of its fragmented constituent elements.
All right. Sir, you've been waiting patiently. Thank you. Tom?
Okay. Hi, I'm Galen Carey with the National Association of Evangelicals. My question's about culture. We've heard about how the culture has taken us in unwise and directions that are not conducive to human flourishing. Who is it that's actually been doing this to us? A majority of us Americans are identified as Christians, so do we bear a lot of the responsibility ourselves? And if a young Christian, say, just starting out their career, they say, I want to devote my life to fixing the problems that you all have articulated, what should they do? Should they become school teachers, go into academia? Should they become like entertainers or social media influencers, or what, or should we try to create our own, more healthy subculture that has its own institutions and so on, or what do you all recommend?
Great, thank you. Panelists? Don't all leap at once to answer that question. Do you retreat, or do you try to shape the culture? I think that's sort of a threshold. And then if you're not going to retreat, how do you go about doing this? Where do you aim?
Obviously, retreating is not an option. I mean, that we're called to bear witness to our faith. But in entering the culture, the danger is always to adopt the terms of the culture. And I think one of the things that we need to become, I think we're beginning to become more aware of that than maybe we had been in previous generations, because some of the implications of basic presuppositions are becoming more evident. But the problem is very subtle, and for instance, if Abigail was right that the sort of technological advancements are inseparable from this new cultural of self-invention, then what does it mean to embrace the technological means as an attempt to overcome it? I mean, have we already in a way sold the farm, as it were? And that's a really difficult question, because on the other hand, it seems like the only alternative is a kind of fortress mentality, which is sterile and I think not true to the gospel. So I don't know that this question can be answered in a universal way. I think each of us, whether to become a teacher I think each of us needs to find out what we're meant to be and be that, and do it in a way that's sort of faithful and informed and enlightened, and assume that we can't fix the problem in this sort of technological way, that we're going to find a solution and implement a program to solve it. It needs to be much more organic and emerge in a perhaps a quiet way from the heart of a faithful existence.
Anyone else on the panel? No? Okay.
Great to be with you all. Louis Brown with the Christ Medicus Foundation, also the Catholic Healthcare Leadership Alliance. I'm a lawyer, not a medical practitioner, but and I serve as an associate director under Marc's center, which is outstanding. And please get to know Marc. He's amazing. If you don't know him, he just moved here to D.C. So my question, it's a question and a comment, kind of. So when I was at HHS and really looking at issues around transgender, the scientific medical research studies, particularly in Europe, as Mary knows so well, it just shows that it's completely bankrupt for the human person, that folks are literally taking a nosedive into death when they start kind of, practicing gender ideology upon themselves, right? And looking at suicide rates and all of those things. And so this culture of self-invention that we talk about, I thought of some words, what we're seeing with the culture, even the Surgeon General talked about this, and I talk about this everywhere I go, but you see this kind of hatred of self, you see despair, this isolation, fear, anxiety, the mental illness rates amongst the high school students through the roof. And so it's like, it's just not working. And I think something that we should be talking about as Catholics is there's a need for more integrated answers from the legal, the political, the cultural, but also in terms of our evangelization. And so for us to start talking about the goods of religion, the goods of community, the human flourishing that there's, and I think, Abigail, you kind of talked about this, that there's this deeper freedom, there's a love and a joy that comes with the restraints that nature places upon us, and to talk about the attractiveness to exercise, Bill Muma talks about this, to exercise our religious liberty, to exercise our religion, and not just kind of this defensive crouch. So that's just kind of a comment, these integrated answers that appeal to the human person, to the flourishing and all of that. My question is, culturally, legally, philosophically, and Mark, we've talked about this, but what's the hope for the natural law on some of this, on some restoration there, as a way to kind of balance the culture, balance the law, and our philosophical understanding? So that's my big question. Thank you.
Mark, you want to tackle that first?
They're very excellent questions, and I'm not up to the challenge to answering them, unfortunately, but I'll do my best. I think, just on the last point, Louis, there's always hope for the natural law. In American law, my view is that the best hope for it is, the best way that I can put this is from the ground up rather than from the top down. So to recur a little bit back to something that I was thinking about in response to what Abigail said, if there's a hope for natural religion, again, to answer some of what the bishop had asked about earlier, as grounding or rendering coherent the concept of religion, it's going to be in concepts like, well, don't we think that religions have systems of belief that unify them? Don't we think that they have some kind of groupish quality that unifies them? Phenomena that we can trace in important ways to principles of the natural law, but that don't scream natural law as a kind of top-down principle by which we can climb out of the hole that we're in. And this is why I think practice-based insights, or almost like keyholes into the natural law, might possibly be the best approach, at least in the area of religious liberty, but perhaps more broadly, to render coherent a concept that has, again, liquidated, in my view, in the law.
Anyone else want to speak to that, or if not, Bishop Dale? Oh, go ahead.
Natural law is hope, if you think about it. I mean, but to understand natural law, we need to recover a sense of nature, and nature is one of the givens we've been talking about. And precisely as given, it's always there. I mean, nature is always there. The tradition is always there. These things are an enormous source of hope and joy. The word has been co-opted in a context that it has no business of being in, the joy of abortion rights. I mean, it doesn't make any sense at all. But in the context of the givens, so we have the privilege of defending things that can't possibly, in a way, lose.
I'll add one comment to that. I know just in working with families who've had children who have identified as transgender, et cetera, one proven way to move those kids away from that obsessive thinking is to get them back to nature, is to get them off the technology, have them relate in person, understand their body, feel their body, realize that's who they are. So it's coming back to that very realness that's part of who we are. So, Bishop Daly.
I'm Bishop Tom Daly from the Diocese of Spokane, and I'm finishing up my time as chair of the Committee on Catholic Education. But Abigail was interested in that point about finding maybe a value when you're dealing with young people. As chair of education, you get people calling the office, my son goes to this school in Midwest. Bishop, can you come and find out why they're allowing 20 genders on the checklist of the application? And I think with young people, just in an academic setting, I'm wondering, so often how do we get to this point? So many of our institutions entrusted with guiding young people have failed. And whether it's in healthcare, social services, and higher education. And that, I think, almost our biggest trouble has been caused by within. And the longer I'm a bishop, I think we get into these situations because of weak leadership, men who are afraid of being canceled. Those who are the great compromisers, we have to go along to get along. And then I don't want to scandalize all of you. I don't know what some men believe. Really, do they believe what Christ has entrusted the church? So with young people, you talk to them, what is the greatest value? To be non-judgmental. And then they proceed to say something about what the church does. So dealing with, that academic, and I kind of shape these things because I spent most of my life in teaching. And then I go to the Silicon Valley as an auxiliary bishop and they begin to think they are the creator. And there's no humility. Then I go to a slice of rural America, and it's a breath of fresh air because there's always a sense of something more of God in a rural area that depends upon the rain and a slower pace, and you're providing for a need, which is food, as opposed to so often technology, which is a want. But the point of the church, I'm the first to say we could have done a lot more. But what have you found? Are there signs of hope when you try to talk to young people to get them beyond? Because the language has been so often hijacked. Any messages for a troubled America we can bring back?
I actually think there are signs of hope, especially thinking about the kind of realm of youth gender medicine. I think the tide is turning globally. I think it'll be messy in America because we have a profit-driven, decentralized healthcare system, and the professional organizations have been captured. And so there's an appeal to the standards of care set by the medical professional organizations that then protect doctors from malpractice. So it's going to be messy, but I really do think the tide is turning. Even if you just look at like the New York Times coverage of this particular debate over the last 2 years, and how something they completely avoided, didn't even talk about, and now, are actually publishing about. So I think that I don't know how, I think we've peaked perhaps on that. I don't know how long the downslope is. I also think perhaps that we've peaked on the kind of gender craze in youth culture. I think it's beginning to maybe become something that's like a phase you go through in middle school, but it's not, one of the benefits of youth culture is that things change so rapidly, right? Now, in terms of whether this kind of option to transition more broadly, I think it's always going to be on offer because we have the technologies which create a demand and there's a profit incentive there, and so I think it's not going to go away altogether. But I do think the kind of cultural capture on this question is shifting, and I think when it comes to young people, when they choose a boutique gender identity, what they're often doing is kind of wanting a sense of belonging and articulating an experience. And I think the problem is that our culture confuses experience with essence. And so what is kind of what they're articulating as an experiences of themselves in relation to perhaps gender stereotypes or in relation to the culture is then kind of enshrined as some sort of absolute identity. So I think in some ways we just kind of need to like keep calm, let young people kind of bounce around with their identifications. And of course the problem is then kind of adults in authority coming alongside and affirming that, even concretizing it through medical interventions, right? So that's sort of the problem, but I think the kind of pushback we're seeing across the political spectrum to that kind of unquestioning affirmation, I think is encouraging. So,
Okay, great. Last question, Tim.
Yeah, Tim Schultz from the First Amendment Partnership. This has, by the way, been a great panel. First time I'm hearing all of you. I've known Mary for a long time, but the rest of you, just thank you very much. Great panel. My question's for Abigail. Your point about vocabulary was really well taken. I mean, I work in religious liberty. I've sort of been arguing myself. I refuse to use the word religious exemption and have for like 10 years because it pulls very badly. So I say religious protection because for whatever reason people are more accepting of religious protections than they are religious exemptions. My question for you, Abigail, is could you just sort of talk for about 90 seconds about say this, not that?
oh, wow. Well, the reason it's tricky is because it's a little bit contextual, right? So I think in general, gender is such a fraught, ambiguous, equivocal term that if you're going to use it, there has to be a good reason. You have to clarify what you mean, right? I don't think it should be anywhere near the law because it's so ambiguous and equivocal. So I think when it comes to the law, using the term sex, not gender, is really important. I often use the term sexual difference because sex also has this other, we're handed like such a crap sandwich, honestly, when it comes to the language, because it's like gender has too many meanings, but sex also has this like double meaning, so you have to kind of clarify what you mean when you're saying sex anyway. So it can be sort of tricky, but I think just be aware that the term gender is used in so many different ways. When it comes to words like masculinity and femininity, increasingly, speaking of John Paul II, so John Paul II was very intentional in using those terms primarily or almost exclusively in relation to persons and not attributes. So I think it would be good to kind of not say that certain activities are feminine or masculine, but to actually talk about masculinity and femininity as kind of the living out of one's sexual identity in the world. Because I think some of the confusion around gender is that things have become gendered in a sense. And so if you have a young boy who likes girl things, the cultural intuition is that, well, maybe he's not really a boy, right? So I think thinking carefully about how we use the adjectives or the modifiers masculine and feminine is important. The singular they, I never use that. I think it's so, and that's more like a grammar nerd thing because it's so ambiguous. There are times when you'll read a sentence and you're like, wait, how many theys are we talking about here? It's just very confusing. Is this a one they, a many they? So I just, when it comes to, I think those are more, linguistic fads, avoiding the linguistic fads if possible. So those are just some initial thoughts.
I'll put an exclamation on that. Don't use any word that has as its premise something that's anthropologically false. So cisgender, transgender, cisgender is an invented word to normalize transgender. We should never acquiesce to that. Same thing with sex assigned at birth. There's a premise there that sex is not real, it's arbitrary, it's a label, et cetera. So, look for those premises. And I think, unfortunately, within the church, we've kind of gotten ourselves into trouble in some respects by taking on the language of the culture, thinking we're meeting people where they are, and really what we're doing is we're giving away the premise. And that's a problem. So I think we're up. So perhaps you can bring your question to the afternoon. So thank you very much to our panelists. Terrific job.
Thank you very much. That was really great, lived up to the billing, so thank you so much for all of your thoughts. Before we eat, as I mentioned earlier, we have a couple people to thank. One is Institute for Human Ecology at Catholic University of America is sponsoring this lunch. But the other person that you should thank at some point is Diana Brown, who you should have met earlier when you received your name badge. Had I been organizing this, again, this probably all would have fallen apart. But she is the reason that everything is so well organized and that you are going to have a good lunch to enjoy. So be sure that you thank her at some point because she's been really great. So we will eat lunch and then we'll come back up at 1. Bishop Rhoades, would you come and bless our food for us?
In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, amen. God our Father, we thank you for this beautiful day. We thank you for all of your blessings. We ask you to continue to pour out your blessings upon our symposium. We thank you that for the food that we're about to receive with grateful hearts as we pray together. Bless us, O Lord, and these thy gifts, which we are about to receive from thy bounty through Christ our Lord. Amen. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.